Welcome to Technically, the webinar series dedicated to the technical challenges of making the web accessible. On this webisode, we have web accessibility specialist Eric Eggert. It would really help if I unmuted myself. All right, ladies and gentlemen, and all variations thereupon, welcome to this October 2019 edition of Technically. It is fantastic to have you with us today as we kick off our second season. Yes, it's been a full calendar year since our first webisode, so a hail and hearty thank you to those who have been with us every month since then, and I do see some of you in the participant window, and an enthusiastic and warm welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. We hope you'll continue to join us in the future as we continue to present these deep dives into the, well, technical aspects of making the web accessible. Today's presenter is Eric Eggert. Welcome, Eric.
Hello.
Eric
I'm unmuted.
All right, Eric is, as I said, a web accessibility specialist. He is with Knowbility and a member of the W3C's Web Accessibility Initiative. And he'll be talking today about the pitfalls one can come across while using the accessible, rich internet application attributes. In one of the most cleverly named presentations I've seen in a long time, ARIA Serious. I know I hear a lot about the misuse of ARIA on a daily basis at Tenon and how it's meant to supplement HTML, but unfortunately too many developers tend to use it instead of proper semantic HTML. But I'll let Eric cover that, so take it away, Eric.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. This is my talk, ARIA Serious. I'm a web developer, teacher who works with Knowbility, which is an Austin nonprofit on improving the web for people with disabilities. And 50% of my time that I work with Knowbility goes to W3C in a fellowship model, so I can do things like working on tutorials and other stuff. So that's really nice from Knowbility. So that's why I want to shout out and say thank you for that. This is a presentation that I like to give because it's it has two components in it. It's first an overview, and then we look at practical examples, real life examples. But that means because those are real life examples, I have to put a warning up first. This presentation contains ARIA examples that are preventing websites and applications from being accessible. So please don't just copy and paste that code that is in this presentation, because it breaks stuff. That's the whole point. I will do my best to describe the code examples that I have in there and read them aloud. So if there is something that I need to repeat or specify, please let me know. So what is WAI-ARIA really? So Michael already said it's the accessible rich internet applications. That's the ARIA part. And the WAI part is Web Accessibility Initiative. So there has been a name clash, and so we had to prefix it. So it is one of those, you can basically ignore the WAI part and be good with it. But the core is with ARIA that the attempt was to take accessibility APIs that are present on the desktop, in this case, like a Windows XP type of desktop environment, and map that to the web. So making it possible that that web applications can basically use the same APIs as native applications on those platforms. So it's really important to know that this is about internet applications. The emphasis is on that. And then we have to keep that in the back of our mind when we use it, especially on non-application-y websites. Some might think ARIA is just you put it on and it works, but it's neither witchcraft nor sorcery. It just doesn't work like that. You really have to know what you're doing. There's no ARIA dash make dash accessible equals true, that just makes your website accessible like in one fellow swoop. It's how ARIA interacts with the rest of your content. And we have to understand ARIA and the principles, the underlying principles, fully, and then deploy it where we need it. There are 5 rules of ARIA from the Using ARIA document. And I think going through them one by one really gives us a good impression on what that is. And I have a couple of examples and demos in there, so we know how to use ARIA. So the first rule is if you can use a native HTML element or attribute with the semantics and behavior you require already built in, instead of repurposing an element and adding an ARIA role, state, or property to make it accessible, then do so. That's a very complicated way to say, if there's an HTML element that does what you want it to do, then use this HTML element. The second rule of ARIA is do not change native semantics unless you really have to do. And that basically means the semantic of HTML elements is already set. A paragraph is a paragraph. A list item is a list item. We already know that. So if you don't really have to change that, then don't. And there are only a couple of really good reasons to change the native semantics. So this is one example here. And I've seen such things in real life. It's an H1 with the role button, and then it is a heading button. That is what the developer thought they were doing. But the problem is that this is now, because we have the role button, this is not a heading anymore. So a screen reader user using heading navigation would never find the H1 because it's not a header anymore. Once you put a role attribute on an element, it takes away the semantics that are already there and replaces them with the new semantics. So this is now only a button and only semantically. Please don't copy this. The good example is having an H1 and then a button inside that. And then you have basically both. You have a H1 and you have a button, and that works. And it also has like keyboard navigation stuff built in, which is also important. And if you say, oh, this makes, nobody would do stuff like this, sometimes you see gems like this from my colleague Nick Steenhout, who found this in an accessibility audit, an H2 with the class H3 with the role heading, because it already is a heading, but we add a role heading to just make sure. And then there's ARIA level 1. So actually, this is an H2 that looks like an H3, but for screen reader users, it's actually announced as an H1. Why one would do something like that, I don't know, but people are doing some stuff like this all the time. So in this case, there is an element that has a role heading and a level 1, and that's an H1 element. So use the H1 element. Really simple rules here for ARIA. Third rule, I already talked about that. All interactive ARIA controls must be usable with the keyboard. And that's interesting because there are two things in there. So first there's the keyboard, and the other thing is interactive ARIA controls. So there are two classes of ARIA controls. There are simple controls like buttons and stuff like that. Those are interactives. And then you have like the really complex ARIA widgets, like let's say a date picker or a grid navigation or something like that. And those have different needs for keyboard navigation. If you create a widget that the user can click or tap or drag or drop or slide or scroll, a user must also be able to navigate to the widget and perform an equivalent action using the keyboard. So if everything you can do with the mouse to an interactive element, there must be an equivalent way to do it with the keyboard, which makes sense. And all interactive widgets must be scripted to respond to keyboard keystrokes or keystroke combinations where applicable. So this is basically reformulating the same thing. So basically, if the element does not have the native way to react to keystrokes, then using standard keystrokes can help. Then you have to use JavaScript to put those native keystrokes in and basically rebuild it. And that's a good example in the ARIA practices guide, and I use it because this is a really simple thing. So if you use roll button on a div, for example, then the element must be able to receive focus, and the user must be able to activate the action associated with the element using both the enter or return key and the space key. So if you are using JavaScript to build a button, it must work with enter on Windows or return on macOS, which is the same key. It just has a different name and nobody knows why. Somebody probably knows why. And it also has to work with the space key. If it doesn't work with both, then you're basically violating the expectation of the user for such an element. You know, a user expects that a button works with the space bar. And I have a demo here. Those are 4 buttons, and they are labeled first, second, third, and fourth. And they are implemented in different ways. So going back to the HTML, I basically, the first one is a real button with the class bouton, and then we got a div. Then we got a div with the tab index equals 0, and then we got a div with tab index equals 0 and the roll button. And I also got an event listener that listens for the click event, and that's on purpose. So if we go through it using the keyboard navigation, probably I just tell what happens and be the human screen reader. So you tap through, and this, because it's a button, it would announce as first button. This would be great. So now if I press the tab key, because the second button is just a div, and although it works like, you know, with the mouse as you would expect, but because this is only a div without anything else, it can't actually be focused, so it is automatically skipped. So I go to third, and this is only reachable because it has the tab index 0. So from here to from first to second, we have basically given up all the semantics. It would not announce as a button because it doesn't know that it's a button. And the third would just announce as third group, or in other screen readers it would be different, but it would not be announced as button. It would just, because that information is not given anywhere. So we can use roll button, and then when we tap here, it would be equally announced as the first one. So the fourth button would be announced as fourth button. And that's great. That's what we want, this announcement. But this gives us still a problem, because this first one, I can go back. If you press enter, you get the dialog box, which is what you would expect. And if you press space, the dialog box is there as well. With the third one, I can press enter and space and nothing happens. And the same is for the fourth one. Because we only have put on the roll buttons and tab index 0, the browser knows it's a button, but there is actually in the background of the browser, on real buttons and real links, they interpret the event listener, the click event listener, the click event, as key down events, and basically make this transparent. So you always get the same interaction when you're using a button. And this is not there if you're just repurposing a div. So the long story short, really, is use a real button if you want button functionality, because otherwise you have to do all that work for yourself. Have to put in all the event listeners for yourself. You have to make sure that it works the right way. So for example, on a button, if you click and then you drag away from the button, then nothing should happen. If you implement it wrongly, like in a different way, you might run into problems where this expected feature is not working anymore. So while a button seems to be like a relatively innocent and simple thing to do, can be actually quite complicated to implement that if you have to do it by hand. So let the browsers do the hard work. Fourth rule. Do not use role presentation or ARIA hidden true on a focusable element. The thing is, role presentation and ARIA hidden true, they remove either the semantics of the element or they remove the element completely. So if I got a button which is inside a role presentation marked up container or has role presentation on it, it will not be announced as button. It's undoing the semantics there. And if you have ARIA hidden true, then this button will just not be there if you're using assistive technology. On screen, you see your focus, it's all good, but a screen reader would just not hear anything. It's like there is nothing and they tap to nothing, and that's bad. And the fifth one is all interactive elements must have an accessible name. So if you have a button, it has to have, some text on the button. That's useful. If you have a link, if you have a menu item, those all need to have accessible name because you navigate to it with your screen reader, and then the screen reader needs to read something. If you don't have an accessible name, there's nothing to read, and a screen reader user does not know what's happening. For example, if you use an icon without any alternative text. There are different ARIA components. So the first thing is roles, and we talked about roles a little bit. We know something like div role main can mark up like the main region on the page. It's better to use just the main element because it's built in. It's already an element that has those semantics, and those are completely equivalent. So you can just use that. You can give a form a role search, so you can use it as a search form. There are role tooltips and alerts. Those are not landmarks, but they are like telling screen reader users, mainly screen reader users, what this element does. And that's probably a good thing to underline here at this point. ARIA is working mostly for screen reader users. So if you don't use a screen reader, there's nothing that tells you, oh, this div is a tooltip or this form is a search form. There's no interface for that. So a lot of people are trying to augment their web applications and websites using ARIA, which is a good thing, but it only works for people who are using assistive technology that actually interprets those ARIA things. So if you're using ARIA and the assistive technology doesn't understand it or the user doesn't use it, then the problem is that you don't get any result. ARIA doesn't help people who are not using ARIA. That seems pretty clear, but yeah, it needs to be underlined here. But there are not only roles in ARIA, there are also states and properties. So properties are basically things where you say, oh, this thing, this element has something that gives it more meaning. So for example, you got an input with an ARIA described by. So you're connecting two things. An ARIA described by points at some text that basically is additional description for the input field. But then there are states. So if you have a button, it can have an ARIA pressed attribute that can be true or false. So that's the state this button is in. So you can have an ARIA pressed fails, and then the user gets to it, says this is a button, it's not pressed, and then the user presses it, meaning pressing return or space, and then your ARIA pressed would be true, in which case it gets read to the user as this button is pressed, which can be useful for toggles and stuff. So, but that's the difference between a property and a state. Yeah, and then there are things like ARIA hidden true, which, as I said, hides stuff from screen readers, which can be useful sometimes, but more often than not, you shouldn't use it. And then there's a tiny portion of ARIA container thingies that are live regions. So if you are using ARIA Live Polite, the text inside of that div, once it's updated with JavaScript, will be read out to screen readers. If you're using assertive, the screen reader will, under certain circumstances, even stop what they're doing at that point and say, oh, you only have like 1 minute left in this transaction. Do you want to extend your time or something like that? So if it's really important, then you can use assertive. But you always have to change the text inside of the div to do that. I already talked a little bit about ARIA support. When you're using an assistive technology that uses it, the support is relatively good for a lot of those landmarks, regions, roles, and states and properties. Usually that's really okay. It also depends, because this is super complicated. The ARIA support not only depends on the screen reader, but also on the browser and on the operating system. So you got basically 7 layers of fun with ARIA, which is great. Hayden Pickering wrote in 2016 an article with the name ARIA Controls is Poop, which always amuses me because emojis are great. And he went in, looked at the support for ARIA controls. And ARIA controls is a property that you can use, for example, on a button, if that button controls another thing. And then in some screen readers, you could go back to that button. For example, you got an expand collapse, and you expand it, and then when you're inside the expand collapse, you're reading the text, you say, oh, I actually want to close this and go to the next one. You can go with ARIA controls, you could go back to that button, close it really easily. That was in 2016. Today, Leonie Watson actually tweeted that JAWS, which was the only screen reader really supporting ARIA controls, has recently reduced support. So the user has to enable it, which is a shame, because it could be a useful thing to do, but it had so many edge cases that it didn't get like broad appeal. And that can be a problem with a lot of stuff, like in the details, in the weeds of ARIA. This is the whole like organizational tree of ARIA. And you can see, well, maybe you can see, but I describe it too. It's basically like a big net of different boxes with different roles and attributes, and they're pointing at each other because they're dependent on each other. And it's like crossing and really like confusing and complicated, because ARIA is really complicated. That's full stop. And that makes it very complicated for web developers as well. And this is where this goes into the fun part, where I tell you stories about really bad code that I've seen. So This is one I've seen. A link with the ID airline logo and a link to the homepage. Then it has the class logo and the ARIA label airline name. And then a non-breaking space in between. So that means a screen reader user would be totally fine with this. Screen reader user would tap to it and it would read the airline name. But for a lot of voice input user, for different, under different circumstances, the ARIA label wouldn't be supported. So they couldn't click on the home logo. That's bad. And we do have a way to do this. It's using an image with an alternative text. Or you could use an SVG with a title. That could work. You know, there are a lot of different ways to approach this. Second one I always think about as interesting is this one, which is a navigation div. It has 3 links in it, basically going to slides. It's a link. The href is JavaScript :void 0, which basically means when you click on this link, do nothing, because the action is prescribed in JavaScript behind the scenes. Then it has a class nav inactive and a role button, because this is actually a button going to a slide, so it's not going somewhere. And then there's a span class hidden text slide 1. So this is useful, and this would work in practice, but it's very complicated. And it also doesn't convey to a screen reader user, for example, what the active slide is. There's only a class that says nav inactive or nav active. And that is not too helpful. What one could do is basically this. You have a nav with 3 buttons and like button elements, and you have a nav element, because that makes sense. And then you have ARIA pressed false and an ARIA label slide 1. If you hide the text anyway, you know, sometimes it's okay to put it into the ARIA label. And this is something that I did here. And then, you know, only the one which is active has the ARIA pressed true. This is a relayed to a screen reader user, and they can go to slide 1, which is unpressed, and then slide 2, which is pressed. That makes sense. But it goes even better if you put in an alternative text, in an image with the alternative text, if you're using like a graphic for those 1, 2, 3 buttons. Another thing that I've seen where developers, and I know that because I'm a developer by heart, we want to be very, very clever. You know, if someone looks at our code, we want them to go like, ooh, that's clever. I think that's what happened here. So this is from a sortable table, and basically it's a th with the content name, and it has a tab index equals 0 and a role button and an ARIA label sort column. Now, I know what the developer was thinking. They were like, oh, a user has to tap to this table heading in order to sort the column, and then the screen reader needs to know that this is a column that they can sort, so I put the ARIA label on it, and it needs to be a button, so I put a button on it. But what that does in combination is that this is not a table heading anymore, a table header anymore. So this is now just a button, and it has no connection to the other table data elements in that column. So it basically broke the accessibility completely. And if the role button wasn't there, everything in that column would be labeled sort column. And as most columns probably would be sort, you know, columns to sort, that means everything would be labeled with sort column, which makes no sense. Name is much better as a label there. So make sure that this doesn't happen. This is a tweet by Paul J. Adam, where he basically had a similar thing happening. So it's a button with the type button and the role button are a required false. Tab index equals 0, and then it's just a 2. And he asks, what the heck? Hashtag facepalm, hashtag accessibility, which is a fair reaction, I think. To unpack that, going from back to forth, so 2 for is not a really good accessible name. That should change, but it also depends on the context. But then you got tab index 0. A button is already reachable by keyboard. You don't need a tab index 0, so just remove it. An ARIA required false, you can't really require a button. I don't know how that would work. I mean, you could theoretically say this button must be pressed, but that's something you'd need to change in JavaScript or read through JavaScript, so you couldn't make it required. So that makes no sense, especially if it's false anyway, because buttons by default are not required. So you can get rid of this. Then it has a role button, which a button already has. So get rid of that. And then you basically have a button type button, which is useful if this button is used inside of a form, because inside of a form, a button by default submits that form, and you don't want that for all your buttons. So you can use type button, but outside of a form, you don't even need that. Another thing that I've often seen is this pattern. It's a span, and it's for an icon. So there's an icon using CSS background or icon fonts, something like that. And then it's a span, ARIA hidden equals true, role image, class icon. So you don't need to put a role image on something that you immediately hide from screen reader users. The role image would make this announced as an image. And then you use ARIA hidden true to say, oh, but please don't announce this image. That makes little sense. So yeah, don't do something like that. If you're thinking about hidden true, can just, in this case, probably just remove the role image and the ARIA hidden true, and then you're good. Depending on your technique to put that icon in. Icon fonts can be tricky. A really bad thing I stumbled on was this one. And this is from a big framework that used to have a dialog component. And when the dialog was up, they wanted to prevent screen reader users from accessing everything inside of the body of the page, because it's a modal dialog. People should interact with that. And they put ARIA hidden equals true on the body, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but it really is not, because that hides everything inside of the body. And as your dialog is also inside of the body, that would also be hidden. You can't selectively unhide stuff inside of an ARIA hidden field. That's just not how this works. And so they basically hid everything from screen reader users, and was hilarious. Not for people who actually needed to use that site, but or those sites. But yeah, it's like a big misunderstanding. And so it's really important to keep that in mind. If you put ARIA hidden true on a container, everything inside is just gone and dusted. So sixth example, and that's one I found. It was a spread in a textbook kind of application, and you had a lot of these links that opened stuff in your windows, and that had a title. Click here to view the video on tab index -1, because they put the tab index or the tab order manually on stuff, which yeah, can do that, but it's work. Avoid work if possible. Then you got a role button and an ARIA label external link. So and there was nothing inside of that link. So what they didn't think about was that ARIA label is overwriting the text of that link. So in the naming algorithm, it would have been okay to have the title, and that would be red, like click here to view the video. But using ARIA label overrode that. And so you had basically like 10 external links on every page, and you didn't know which video is that and where does it link to. Also something I've seen, using an ARIA live region on a carousel. That's always a lot of fun. Just screen readers constantly getting disrupted because of the continual changes. Makes it impossible to use. A lot of fun. And a little bit of like HTML curiosity. If you're using a label for ID and you have an input with the same ID, but it's in a different case, uppercase, lowercase, those attributes are actually case sensitive. So this would break your stuff. So, if you're using ARIA labeled by or something, uppercase and lowercase, they matter for some obscure reasons, but they do. So just keeping that in mind. There are two really good resources to read up on that whole thing, how to implement stuff properly. There is the Authoring Practices Guide, ARIA Authoring Practices Guide. And on the left in the navigation, you basically get grids, you get model dialogues, links, list box, the whole things. And it will also tell you how you have to implement keyboard navigation on those more complex widgets, because that can be very intricate. What happens when you press the right arrow in a calendar grid when you are at the end of the week? Where do you go from there? That's all defined. And then there's the Using ARIA resource that is written by Steve Faulkner and David McDonald, the editors, who make a great job to basically lay out those rules, make sure that you can use ARIA really well with HTML. And by the way, the team doing the authoring practice, also great people. Zoe and Jean and Gemma, great people all around. Conclusion for this whole thing: use landmarks, use dates and properties if you can, if they make sense to you. If you're using widget roles, like the more complicated things that are in the ARIA authoring practices, just keep in mind that there's a lot of keyboard work you have to do, a lot of things that depend on each other. It's quite complicated, and you have to read up and then also test it with browsers and screen readers and make sure that it actually works, because sometimes there is like a small thing in there that doesn't work, and then it's does not make it's not fun if you put a lot of time into it and then you see that something is not supported. And that's it. I'm Eric, and my website is yatil.net, and I'm at yatil everywhere else. And I'm open for questions.
I actually have a little curious question for you. What's the YATL?
People are always asking that, and it's basically when I've been young, I've had a French class, and YATIL with 3 dashes, Y-A-T-IL. That basically means what is. And I found it funny that it has 3 dashes. Mm-hmm. And so I just took it on as my name. And when I stopped taking French classes, my French teacher said to me, "This is a great day for the French language." So, this is basically my French language relationship.
Fair enough. All right. Stuart asks, with ARIA required attributes, will the HTML required attribute on its own be sufficient?
Short answer, yes. So basically the HTML required attribute does everything the ARIA required attribute does, but it also does something more. It gives you automatic validation of your form, and that is useful in certain use cases. So it can. It works a little bit differently, but if you have required on your HTML element, it should be okay.
All right, and he has a follow-up question. Do you have a favorite pattern for ensuring that form inline error messages are accessible?
It's a little bit hard because it always depends on the form. Sometimes inline error messages don't make a lot of sense. Like it makes more sense to like throw the user back and say, oh, there are several things. But sometimes they make sense. I actually wrote or edited a tutorial on w3c.org that has several things. So w3.org/tutorials. One would need to be able to spell that, and there is forms one that has error validating input on the left, and that has several different things, and usually you know, I usually use the standard HTML input fields, and then make sure that I use ARIA describe by with the errors.
Okay. Let's see. Can you speak? John asks, can you speak about if there is a need for elements to have both the same ID and name attributes being the same?
I don't think there's a need for that. It used to be that I think Internet Explorer 6 or 7 or so did not support like jumping to names, jumping to IDs. So you'd need to also give them the name, but I don't think that modern browsers are doing that.
Would you recommend role equals text to help VoiceOver better output text that has multiple spans?
So two answers. I think it can help a lot to do that, but on the other hand, I don't feel that this should be on developers. I think VoiceOver or any screen reader needs to do a better job to do this and work with native HTML. And role text is a non-standard attribute, so I'm worried of it. If you have a certain use case where it is really distracting, then yes, use it. But otherwise, I would not usually use it.
Okay. Roger Smazi has a question that's not quite ARIA related, but badly formed links can be always deemed bad and be demanded change. Is that true? Do you think?
Like, yeah, when there's no href attribute, like no proper href attribute, then the question is this really a link? And usually it's not. But of course, you can change the location in your browser with JavaScript, and then then it would be a link. So yeah, I usually would change it to a button, but yeah, not always. So the basic rule is if you go somewhere to another page, if there's a reload, then use a link, even if you're doing the change with JavaScript. If something happens on the page, then that's a case for a button.
Okay. Carly Gerard asks, can you tell me when a web app should use a true menu/menu item widget versus a straight nav element?
Yes, I can. So if you have a web application, which means something like Google Docs, then you want to use menu and menu item. If you don't have that, there is little reason to use it. Better user navigation and just pointing back there is a tutorial on that. I used to, you know, I've written about all of that. So you just
Perfect. I will definitely have a link for that in the description for the YouTube video.
Yeah. So yeah, I think for most people, menu and menu item is overkill, and it also changes the way you use it with the keyboard, so that can throw keyboard users off.
Okay, a couple more questions and we'll wrap up. Richard Razzo has a question. He wants to revisit exhibit number 2. What would the ideal situation for that one? Just have the text instead of ARIA labels equals ...
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So
Yes.
and that would generally be better for accessibility and SEO.
I don't know a lot about SEO because my philosophy is that search engines want to present stuff to users, and so if your code is user friendly, it probably will be picked up from search engines as well. The thing is, if it's a button, it does not have any like big impact on your SEO, I guess. But the thing where having slide 1, slide 2 inside of the button really shines is when you have voice input, because a voice input user can immediately know what that is. So you actually it would be good if the text would actually be visible.
Okay. Gert Melot asks, is native browser validation accessible enough, or do we need to make it accessible by means of ARIA attributes? For example, only first non-valid entry is highlighted or announced.
I think it works pretty well almost always. You should, if the user presses the submit button and there's an error, going through the first instance makes sense, like setting or highlighting that input field. The browser should do the heavy lifting for you, usually.
Okay.
Trying to bracket that as much as possible.
And Stuart has a follow-up question. I know what the real answer is. Do you have a favorite automated accessibility testing tool? I know what the real answer is, but he asks if you've tried X Pro.
Yeah, I have to contractually say that Tenon is my... No, just kidding. It's a great tool. I use every tool that is out there on and off, but I'm not much of a tool user actually. So what I usually do is I use bookmarklets that are written for mostly myself or that I adapted. And there are a lot of good bookmarklets out there that just reveal stuff to me. And then I do the heavy lifting manually because that's how I roll, because I don't trust no one. Apart from Tenon, obviously.
Obviously, yes. Obviously. All righty then. Well, thank you very much, Eric. That was wonderful. So thank you again, and thank you all so much for being with us today, and I hope you'll join us next time when Tenon's own Carl Groves will be presenting on what? Who knows? We all know that Carl has a whole lot to talk about just about everything, and he hasn't quite decided on the topic yet, so it'll be a bit of a surprise for us all. So on behalf of Eric and Claire, our captioner from ACS, thank you all for joining us, and as always, I hope you learned something today. Have a wonderful day.